Hello everybody, I'm glad you're still with us on these devotions this week. We're telling the story of Esther from the book of Esther in the Old Testament. Esther is now the queen of Babylon. This Jewish woman, although only her uncle Mordecai knows that the queen of Babylon is in fact Jewish. But the story begins to gather pace. Enter on the stage a man who is called Haman. Now, he's probably one of the most despised characters in the Bible, Haman. He was an official in the court of King Xerxes, and he was pretty good at his job, and Xerxes liked him. And Xerxes promotes Haman. Now, Haman had an Amalekite ancestry going back many, many centuries. And as you know, the Amalekites hated the Jews. And it was almost as if this hatred of Jews was part and parcel of Haman's thinking, it like being passed down through the generations. So now Haman is a very influential man in Babylon. And the more senior he got, the more he expected people to kind of bow and scrape when he came by. Now, Mordecai, this is the guy who's hovering outside the palace, Queen Esther's uncle or father, adopted father. Mordecai sees Haman coming down the road or in his great chariot, and whereas everybody else gets up and bows and scrapes, Mordecai just remains seated. He doesn't move. He's Jewish. He doesn't bow down to earthly figures. Only God do you bow down to. And it happens once and it happens twice. And Haman develops a hatred for Mordecai. And he plans his elimination. He hatches a plot to do away with Mordecai. And then he thinks, now hang on a moment. Let's not just do away with Mordecai. Let's do away with all the Jews. And then horror upon horror, this thought that he has to eliminate Mordecai begins to grow into a full-scale plan to have what you might call the first Holocaust, where Jewish men, women and children, young and old, were going to be murdered on a particular day. They decided on the 7th of March. They said, henceforth, next year, the 7th of March, I don't know what year it was, that's when this elimination of every Jew in Babylon is going to take place. Well, the stamp of approval is given by Xerxes, who kind of takes his signet ring off and puts it there. Now it's official. It cannot be revoked. The Jews are going to die a year henceforth on the 7th of March. Well, who hears about this? And who is the first one to do something about it? Good old Mordecai. And he sits and thinks, and he breaks down, and he wears sackcloth and ashes. And people say, what's the matter, Mordecai? He said, it's more terrible than I could ever tell you. I don't have words. This is unspeakable. And then he says, I've got to get a message to my daughter, Queen Esther. Only she can save this situation. So he gets a message into her and says, you've got to do something. And Esther sends back a message and says, really, my hands are tied. I'm not allowed to go in uninvited into the king's presence. I may be the queen, I may be his wife, but he has to invite me. In fact, the law of this land is that if anybody, even the king's wife and the queen, walks in uninvited, they will die. And Mordecai sends a message back and says, but that's not acceptable. Your life is at stake. You're a Jew, and your people's lives are at stake. It's you or death to the Jews of this nation. And Esther thinks about it. And then she notices what Mordecai has written in his message. He says, you have been brought to this royal position of queen of this nation for such a time as this. By which Mordecai is saying, Esther, you need to know that in this extraordinary situation, in fact, God has brought you there. Yes, we made our plans and we schemed and it's all worked out wonderfully, but behind it all, it is God. Now, that's not the word that he used because, interestingly enough, the name God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. No mention is made of God. But when Mordecai says you have been brought to this royal position for such a time as this, the implication is that somebody has brought her to that royal position, and that must surely be the living God of Israel. Why? His timing was going to be perfect because he saw this going to happen and he wanted his person in the position in order to be able to save the Jews. And Esther takes a deep breath and says, fine, I will do what you ask me. It's dangerous, but know this. If I die, I die. And I will do it. Well, you know what happens next? She takes a deep breath and she walks in to Xerxes' rooms. And he looks at her. She's beautifully dressed. I mean, she looks like she's come out of a Dolce and Gabbana fashion shoot. She looks absolutely stunning. And Xerxes looks at her. And he had one way of showing his approval or disapproval. He had a golden scepter. If he held out the golden scepter, that meant you can come closer. And he looks at his queen, and then he reaches down and he extends the golden scepter. And Esther comes forward and touches it. And then they have a conversation. Now let me stop there because that's not the end. But it just tells us of the amazing courage of this woman, Esther. She knew she might not get out of the king's rooms alive. But you know, there often comes a point where you have to take your life in your hands. There comes a point when you have to make a stand for God, though it costs you a lot. And it's a frightening thing sometimes. But I honor Esther when she says, okay, I will do what I need to do here. And if I die, well, I die. Now that's not easily said, but it is the story of this wonderful woman, Esther. Be strong and of good courage, said Joshua to his people. Be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid, for the Lord your God is with you, whithersoever you go. We'll continue the story tomorrow.